Hi everyone, hope you can all hear me. Thanks for joining. Welcome to Economics for Liberation. And today I'm joined by Aisha, Leon, and Samia. So I hope you can all see my screen. And today we've got Nicole helping us with technical difficulties. So if you need anything, just drop a message in the chat box. So just some quick housekeeping. Feel free to write your name and where you're joining from in the chat box, so we know who we're with. Closed captions should be available. That should be a little thing on the bottom. This event is being recorded and it's also live on YouTube. So hi if you're joining us from YouTube. So welcome to Capitalism, Colonialism, and the Climate Crisis. My name's Tanita. I'm a member of the Young Emerging Leaders Collective. Today I'm joined by three amazing panelists, and thank you so much for being here. I'm really glad to have you guys here, and you guys have all inspired me in your own ways, so thank you so much. So first of all, I have Aisha. So Aisha is Director of Movement Building at NEOM, which is the Neocolonial Organizers Network, co-founder of KIN, which is a Black activist and organizers network in the UK, and also presents the New Economics Foundation's weekly economics podcast. Aisha, would you like to just quickly say hi?
Oh, I wasn't prepared. I had to unmute so quickly. Hi, really nice to be here. Thank you for having me. And yeah, looking forward to diving in.
Thank you, awesome. We also had today Leon. So Leon is a scholar and a writer, and he's written loads of amazing things, including, I'm just going to shout out one of my favorites, which is your chapter in The Fire Now, Climate Crisis, Racist Crisis. He's also a member of the Director of the Earth Collective and a co-founder of Breathe. Leon, if you'd like to just quickly say hi.
Hello, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And Samia, we have Samia, who's a climate justice activist, a graduate from Campaign Bootcamp, and a co-founder of Seize the Vote, which is a platform for young people of color to transform the political landscape. So Samia, if you'd like to say hi.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me here.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here, guys. So we're going to crack on. We're a few minutes in. Yeah, we're going to get started. And if you're still joining, that's fine. So to start off, I'm just going to do a quick introduction about what economics for liberation is. Then we're going to go into some analysis, some imagination together, and then finally we'll discuss some of the actions we can take to bring around the changes we want to see in the world. And there'll be questions at the end for our speakers. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll collect them all, and then at the end we'll ask them to all our speakers. Okay, so first of all, what is economics? Economics is basically a social and political science that looks at the way society is organized to satisfy their material needs and wants, to provide for the survival, reproduction, and flourishing of life, and it's basically all about how we manage our resources. And basically economics and economic decisions affect all of our lives all the time. So some of the economic decisions we make for ourselves is things like how we feed ourselves, how we clothe ourselves, where we decide to work, how long we work for, childcare, all of these things come under economic decisions. And then you also have decisions that are made for us, so usually by the government or other governing bodies, such as who has access to healthcare, who has access to safe housing, and these all come under the bracket of economics. So what is liberation? So liberation is collective access to our full humanity. And when this Economics for Liberation is a political education initiative, and basically political education is about understanding the world to change it. And the change, what we're trying to bring about with that change is liberation itself. And so that's when it's not like a pocket of freedom, it's kind of like everything's been abolished, all the oppressed systems have gone, and we're all free equally. And I really like this quote from Shireen Carruthers, which says, "Liberation is a perpetual project of creating and maintaining right relationships between people and with the land we inhabit." So, start us off on analysis. What systems define our global economic reality? So capitalism, colonialism, and neocolonialism are two of them that we're going to be looking at today. So I'm just going to give you some quick definitions for our speakers to get started so we know what the big terms mean. So capitalism is a socioeconomic system driven by profit, where we're split into kind of two categories. So you have the capitalists who own the means of production. So that could be things like a factory, for example. And then we have the workers and the masses, which is us, and we have to sell our labor in order to survive. So that means that the means of survival are not openly accessible. and they're kind of gatekept by the capitalists and all the kind of connecting structures. And then also capitalism is a system that's genocidal and ecocidal in nature, and that's because it's based on the enslavement, subjugation, and colonization of African and other indigenous peoples and lands. So because of these origins, and because of the fact that it requires social separation and social stratification in order for capitalism to function, it structures and reproduces a lot of the hierarchies we have in society today. So racial and gendered hierarchy are two examples of that. So colonialism is essentially full and direct political control over a country where the colonized state is subjugated and dependent on the colonial power. So it's important to note, however, that colonialism didn't really end. Western colonialism more changed form, and that's why we have neocolonialism. So neocolonialism is the contemporary extension of colonialism, and this is one where countries are technically independent, so they're not a colony anymore, but their economic and political policies are indirectly controlled from outside. So for example, by things like debt or conditional policies and those kind of things, they don't really have the control that you would think they have given that they're independent. And neocolonialism is the main instrument of imperialism today. And quickly, imperialism is essentially the highest stage of capitalism. So as you can see, it's all just a big circle with all of these systems. So Walter Rodney, who was a Guyanese revolutionary scholar, said that imperialism is a phase of capitalist development in which Western European capitalist countries, the US, Japan, established political, economic, military, and cultural hegemony over other parts of the world. So it's all about that expansion and exploitation at the expense of the rest of the world. So some of the questions we're just going to be covering now is, how does our current economic system create and maintain injustice? And why are capitalism, colonialism, and the climate crisis inseparable? So Aisha, we're going to start with you. So you work for the New Economy Organizing Network and the New Economics Foundation. So the New Economy is like a focal point for a lot of your work. So could you tell us a bit more about why our current economic system is unsustainable and why we need new economy organizing?
Yes, thank you for such a great introduction. I think it's so rare that you go to a webinar and it starts with just like a definition of terms. I think that's brilliant. So thank you for doing that. Yeah, in terms of that question, why the current economic system is unsustainable, I'm actually going to time myself because I could talk about this for a long time. So I was like, let me just watch that. So I think a quick kind of summary answer to that would be that it's unsustainable because it is inherently a system based on infinite growth on a finite planet. So in a nutshell, you can see there that we're kind of starting with a losing battle right there. But just to go a little bit deeper, part of the reason why the economic system that we're in now is so unsustainable is because it necessitates, exactly as you explained, Tanita, a level of inequality. It needs inequality to survive. But that inequality can only go so far because people will only be oppressed for so long. And capitalism, in order to kind of to succeed, has to have winners and losers because it's based on a scarcity model, which means it's based on the idea that there's only so much to go around. So not everyone can have what they need. So we all have to fight for it. But this model is fundamentally flawed because it's based on a lie. There is more than enough of everything that we need. We can meet all of our basic needs and then some. And nothing has shown this better than COVID, right? When push comes to shove, the money is there to all of a sudden house every houseless person in London, or to give the children who don't have access to internet at home laptops and things so they can be homeschooled. You know, the money is there. It's just at the moment it's in the wrong places. And more people are starting to realize that and to get organized. One thing I want to say that I think is quite important when it comes to neoliberalism, which I think is a kind of specific manifestation of capitalism that we're arguably still in the midst of, is that we have to separate how neoliberalism kind of talks about itself from how it actually works. So neoliberalism has a narrative about who we are as people, which says that we're rational, selfish individuals, and so we should manage the economy by using things like free markets, private ownership, and government should just get out of the way, and therefore we'll achieve maximum growth and everyone will be really happy. But we shouldn't mistake this narrative, whatever we think of that narrative, for the reality of what neoliberal economics actually does, it isn't actually structured around free market economics. It's structured around power, and particularly around the power that comes from owning assets. So basically, really great kind of economists and thinkers like Christine Berry, who's the director of IPPR North, calls this the landlord economy or the extractive economy. And when we don't pay enough attention to that, we're fighting the wrong thing. So contrary to neoliberal myths about market competition and wealth creation, what we actually need to be pushing back against in this moment is the idea that wealth should be produced by controlling assets that other people need. So that's landlords controlling homes, that's energy companies, that's banks, even vaccines. And of course, this isn't new to neoliberalism, right? As I'm sure my fantastic co-panelists will talk about in more depth, British capitalists have been extracting wealth from others since the dawn of time through colonialism, slave trade, other things in that vein, and imperialism, the things that you explained as well, Tanita. But essentially, just to sum up on this point, we have to be pushing back against the right enemy, right? We need to be identifying the fact that we're talking about power now. And we're living in an economic system that's on the brink of collapse directly because that power has become too much to be contained, and the inequality it has created has become too much for people to bear. And it's not just things, right, like people realizing that it's very likely that if you're under 35, for example, and you don't have money from your parents, you're going to be spending at least 50% of your income on rent a month for the rest of your life, or the discovery of things like the fact that, oh, that's my timer, almost done, that the person that, you know, your lost loved one, for example, was one of more than 130,000 deaths in the UK since 2012 that could have been prevented by better public health policy, for example. But the thing that's actually mobilizing people right now is this growing awareness that we're living in an economic system that survives and thrives when we're anxious and when we look inward and say, what's wrong with me, rather than taking to the streets in protests and taking action against it. And we're not doing that anymore. We are kind of standing up now and looking to build a just and sustainable economy. And I think things like this are a really important step in that direction. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely agree. Thank you. So Leon, I'm going to go on to you now. So could you tell us a bit about why capitalism and colonialism, how capitalism and colonialism have structured climate breakdown, and why exactly the climate crisis is a racist crisis?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things to get established about climate breakdown is that it's not an issue of emissions, right? We're often told that climate change, climate breakdown is a problem to do with the emission of greenhouse gases. And on one level, that's clearly true, because those emissions are what give rise to the effects of a warming climate and an increase in the global average temperature. And the effects of that are what we the problems that we need to deal with in terms of climate breakdown. However, I would say that climate breakdown is actually a problem of social organization. And the reason that I'd say that is that we could look to any example of recent extreme weather events that have dominated the headlines, or in some cases, sadly, haven't even been in the headlines, to better understand how it's a problem of social organization. So for instance, there was a report today that there's an ongoing drought in Kenya that threatens the lives of over 2 million people. There's also an ongoing drought in Ethiopia. There's inundation and flooding and unseasonable rain taking place in Bangladesh. And if I were to mention wildfires, perhaps your minds would go to North America. Maybe think of the fires that were covered quite widely in Oregon or in California this year, some of which are still ongoing. But it's quite likely that you won't have heard about the deadly wildfires in Algeria, the devastating flooding taking place in Uganda and Nigeria, and the severe drought conditions that are ongoing in Madagascar, which is leading to famine there. And the reason that the latter you probably wouldn't have heard of, or wouldn't have heard of as much, is precisely because one of the questions of social organization, and when I talk about social organization, I would include a lot of the points that Aisha was making about the economy. I think society and the economy are entwined. When I talk about social organization, I am thinking about how our economies are also organized, and I think we're going to come on to discuss that later. But the point is that we've organized our societies in such a way that some people's lives don't matter as much as other people's lives. And this ties into the point that Aisha was making about, you know, how value is generated in society, where wealth is created, and who benefits from the wealth that's created, whether that the benefits are distributed evenly. They're clearly not. So in richer countries, such as in the US, if you see parts of the country that have been hit by extreme weather, for instance, New Orleans, the people who have been most severely affected are often people of color. And in those countries that I mentioned previously, where people are being disproportionately impacted by climate breakdown in the here and now, we can see that those people's lives have been either devalued, or worse still, their lives have been calculated as being acceptable collateral, collateral damage, a price willing to pay. Literally, people's lives are seen as disposable, so long as we can continue this system of endless growth and accumulation that Aisha so well outlined. So the point about why this is all connected to colonialism and its legacy in contemporary capitalism is that the resources that we need to deal with climate breakdown have not been distributed evenly. And the reason that they haven't been distributed evenly is because the power that's associated with those resources is neither distributed evenly. And all of this stems from how our societies, economies, political systems have been kind of arranged in ways that directly and indirectly, and I think your introduction of concepts at the beginning was really helpful for this, in ways that prioritize certain economies and societies over others. So those colonizer countries and people who live within countries that have been colonial powers benefit from a disproportionate level of access to resources. So when we go back to thinking about extreme weather and climate breakdown, we know that it's not just a question of emissions, it's a question of resources, how those resources are distributed, and indeed how those resources allow some people's lives to be valued more highly than others. And as I say, all of this emerged out of a system of violent expansion and extraction, namely colonialism. Again, I see your definition at the beginning. And it was with colonialism that race as a marker of difference came to be so fundamental. I'll stop there because I think otherwise I'll go on. But yeah, we can come back to it, certainly. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you really laid that out for us. Thank you. So Samia, could you tell us a bit about why having an anti-capitalist and anti-neocolonialist stance is so crucial when addressing the climate crisis?
I just want to echo what Aisha said at the beginning, like, thank you so much for having those definitions at the beginning. I think it's so important to like reiterate them, even though people may know what capitalism is, what colonialism is, imperialism, etc. Because I think sometimes we forget like the true definition of what exploitation actually looks like. And yeah, the reason why I think being anti-neocolonialist and anti-capitalist is just simply to avoid green capitalism, to stop the same mistakes of the systems we live in the future. As climate justice activists, we're fighting for a future for collective liberation, as you mentioned at the very beginning. And I really like that term because it always reminds us as we're fighting that this isn't just about me, someone who's situated in London, the UK. It's about people in other countries, other continents that tend to be overlooked just simply because of the geographical location, because of the access to wealth, power, and resources, or lack of access, I should say. And I just want to like bring it down to a local level where we kind of see a snapshot of what a world would look like if we keep building green solutions on top of a capitalist system. So in London, just for context, I used to be an air pollution activist. I campaigned against air pollution in East London. East London's historically a low socioeconomic area where you tend to find Black and brown communities. And the reason why I was an activist a few years ago, paying attention just to air pollution was because no one was talking about the public health issue of air pollution in Black and brown communities in London. And now that we're in an era where people are more aware of air pollution, notice how the solutions tend to serve white, middle class areas, neighborhoods, where they say, oh, we're going to pedestrianize like your roads, we're going to make your areas more cycle friendly. And those initiatives tend to be implemented in areas where people have access to like the resources and the wealth to make that happen. And what you see is you have all like roads where you have low income households where they situate, is that they don't have access to those green solutions. They are left at the back burner of the conversations when it comes to cleaning up green areas. The reason why I brought that example is just that I think little things like that people tend to overlook. And it's like, imagine all those local initiatives build up like globally. And what we see with green solutions being made up of European leaders, especially, is that people of color tend to be left out of the conversation, and other marginalized communities as well. And that is why it's important for me to make sure that I bring colonialism and capitalism into the conversation when talking about the climate crisis, because you have European leaders saying, oh, well, the leaders are creating a green, bright, new future. And it's like, but for who? Like, who exactly is this future for? Who has access to that future? Who has a say in what that future actually looks like? And that is something that I tend to always bring people back into that conversation, because people aren't used to having conversations that talk about collective liberation. We don't, because in this capitalist society, we don't have the time to actually sit down and reflect on who our policies serve. And one thing I saw during the pandemic was people becoming more aware, more enlightened about how systems serve them or do not serve them. And that is something that is really something that I'm passionate about, and I like to bring into conversation, especially with young people, because again, talking about neocolonialism can be really grand. It can be something that is heavy. And I want to make sure that if we're going to do this work, we actually need to be on the ground in our community and make sure that this work is accessible to people, because if you want to empower a new generation, you need to first make them aware, but also empower them with the tools and resources to combat the systems that they are oppressed by. And yeah, this is something I just wanted to mention when I talked about a future towards racial justice, where me and Equinox, the Initiative for Racial Justice, basically wrote a paper talking about how the EU Green Deal is basically green capitalism, like blatantly green capitalism, because they never mentioned what they're going to do for communities that are marginalized across Europe. And we actually saw indigenous communities in Europe being neglected and left out of the conversation. And this is why we need to be stronger when it comes to anti-colonialism, because they're just going to repeat the same mistakes, but make it shiny, green. They're going to cover it with electric vehicles, with renewable energy. And people seem to forget, where are those resources to make that technology coming from? Again, we're repeating the same systems again. And what we're doing is basically appeasing the consumers to say, oh, if you get this electric vehicle, life is going to be fine, Earth is going to be great, emissions have been reduced. But where do those materials come from? Like some of the batteries in electric vehicles, like lithium, for example, they come from Central Africa countries. So that is why I'm like heavy and strong every stride I take in the climate justice fight, to make sure that we are anti-colonialists. And there's something that is rarely mentioned when it comes to being anti-colonialist in the climate justice movement is our approaches. So we need to make sure our approaches are anti-colonialist. So I turned down events when I realized, oh, hey, I know someone in XYZ country who's not in Europe, who's not in the US, where they have a better stance and position to speak about this, because they actually have a lived experience in what we're talking about. And I want to shout out Green Generation, which is an organization, or a collective, I should say, of Black young activists who basically reach out to the Black diaspora across the world, making sure that everyone is basically covering covering the climate justice fight by sharing resources and making sure that we share our wealth, knowledge, and resources with them, just so that we can make the fight more fair. And it's not just about us here in Europe. And I'm gonna stop there. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. And thank you for that shout out. Yeah, it was really great to hear about organizations that are doing that kind of work. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to the next section, which is essentially about imagining what the economy would look like in a liberated future. So what's going to happen is the panelists are going to answer this question each, but also while they're answering, everyone in the audience can also answer at this poll online. So we're just going to send the link in the chat, and you can click on that and you can open that in a new document, and that's going to create a word cloud of everyone's ideas. So please click on that link or set that link and copy that into your documents, into your browser, and then yeah, answer that question. And to start, we'll hear from, yeah, Aisha, if you want to answer the question for us. Thank you.
Polls and word clouds, you guys are so good, man. I run webinars and it is not this swish. I'm learning a lot from you. Yes, imagination. I feel like mine's going to be quite boring because I am very entrenched in the new economy space, and so most of my thinking is quite policy focused, so I apologize in advance. Hopefully the other panelists would be more exciting than me. One quick thing I did want to say just before I go into this bit was just following on from what Leon and Samia said, that I think a really good example of this kind of climate solutions that we don't want to see is the fact that, you know, with the California wildfires that Leon mentioned, I was really shocked a couple of months ago to discover that up to 40% of the firefighters fighting those fires were incarcerated folks, so prisoners who are paid $2 a day to do that, most of whom are people of colour. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have private companies that are hired by rich folks in those areas to come and protect just their homes and not the rest of the place. And then you have lots of people in the middle who live in those places, can't afford to have a private company come, and also don't fall into the kind of catchment area where the government are sending the incarcerated folks who also happen to be the working class people of colour who lose their houses. So I think it's just a really good example of how the solutions to not only the green shiny solutions, but the solutions to the kind of devastation that is going to be brought about by climate change are going to be tackled in an equally horrendous way, and we've got to be aware of that. On to imagining something better. So yeah, if we understand, as I said before, the kind of current economic model as an extractive one, which is run by asset owners, then part of building the new economy is about finding new ways to kind of challenge concentrations of power. So kind of excavate and challenge these areas where there are these huge concentrations of power, whether that's big corporations like Google and Facebook, etc., not paying tax. Sorry, I hadn't started my timer. Or big pharma kind of hoarding vaccines and things like that. So I think that is like has to be a core element of building a new economy, is identifying these kind of sites of power and then challenging them in a really strategic way. And I think there's great organizations like London Renters Union, right, who do this in a very practical way. They identify the source of power as local landlords. They gather together collectively to challenge those sites of power. I think it's also about, as Leon said, recognizing that the scope of the economy is so much broader than what we traditionally think about it as. It's ultimately about how we mobilize the resources that we have to help people live good lives. And so I think also my imagination when I think about a new economy is one in which we all understand that. We understand that the economy isn't just money, it's also about the kind of education that we can give our children, and the streets that we live on, and the air that we breathe, and the quality of life we have in general. All of that is, when we're talking about those things, we're talking about the economy. And a few kind of key principles I think I would want to see it designed around. So the first one is basic economic rights. So the idea that housing, food, care, these things are a human right, and that we need to take them out of the market and guarantee them for everyone. Crucially, including people like migrants, regardless of citizenship status. So it's not something that's tied to nationhood, but it's essentially a collective agreement that there is a standard of living below which we don't think anyone should fall, and that we're all collectively responsible for meeting that standard. The second one is democratic ownership. So this is the idea that if the problem is that there's a tiny elite that control the assets, then part of the answer is to democratize ownership of those assets, right? So not individually, like things like right to buy, but collectively. So through different models of public ownership, things like community land trusts, co-ops, things like that. And then the last one is, the last principle would be around collective power and decision making. So very linked to what Samir and Leon were saying, making sure that people who are impacted by decisions have a seat at the table to discuss those things, and can really participate in the construction of the economy, which is just absolutely not the case right now. Like there, you know, you might have a kind of local council have a meeting to decide how a small pot of money is going to be spent, but large scale participatory budgeting is just not something that's ever come close to being done in this country. And I think that that's really, that's a game changer. How am I doing on time? I think I have 1 more minute. I just wanted to talk real quickly about GDP, because I think this is so important and again often overlooked. A huge thing that needs to change is just how we measure the health of the economy. So at the moment, the health of the economy is measured based on how much we produce, right? How much we produce and import, export with other countries. And that excludes so many really important things. Like it doesn't reflect the reality of people's lived experience. It also doesn't distinguish between good and bad economic activity. So for example, a theatre performance or a shelter for domestic violence survivors counts just as much as bullets for a gun or weapons, you know, things like that. They count as just as much in GDP. It also counts everything. It's not a net figure. So the more you produce, the higher it goes. So if you make a really shit car that collapses next year, that's actually better for GDP overall than making a sustainable car that lasts for a really long time, because you're not remaking a new thing, if that makes sense. It also doesn't include things like impact on the environment, unpaid labor, so childcare, all these kind of things, domestic labor, voluntary work. It's basically just a terrible way to measure how a country is doing. And there's been some really interesting work from IPPR and NEF and other people that look at this idea of an alternative to GDP, which is kind of a dashboard, which has a number of, key indicators that we would look at to measure the health of an economy instead of GDP. So it would look at the distribution of gains from growth. So not just how much is being produced, but where's it going? Changes in poverty rates, changes in well-being, kind of disaggregated by income. It would look at the gap between the richest and the poorest, and then it would look at climate and carbon emissions and a cost-effective path to decarbonisation. So just by very nature of measuring, of being forced to measure those things, it would incentivize the government and the actors within it, and also people in society, to have just a much broader understanding of what the economy looks like, because what we measure matters, right? That's what we think is important. So that's my very nerdy answer to an imagined future. I'm going to throw over to the others for something a bit more spicy, I imagine.
No, that was great. I enjoyed that. Thank you. Leon, do you want to go ahead and answer?
I'll give it a go. I have to say that mine is much less rigorous, much more woolly and yeah, speculative, let's say. It was nice. I mean, yeah, coming from the academy, it's nice hearing people who can talk policy, because a question we always get asked is, you know, what if you don't, everything that's so bad with this system, what are you going to replace it with? And I think there were some really good, tangible ideas there from Aisha that I will definitely be borrowing or citing, let's say, in future responses to that question of what do we do, but to allow myself a little bit of imaginative thinking on it. I guess I'm torn between wanting to say that on the one hand, we can't imagine the world that we want to see because we're so deeply steeped in cultures of being, ways of being, cultures of organizing. I mean, in sociology, we have various terms like habitus or socialization, that our very ways of thinking are so kind of confined by having grown up in a world of capitalism or capitalist social relations, that it's really hard to even imagine the possibilities that would be opened up by a shift in how we've organized our economy for liberation. But I mean, on the other hand, I think there are examples of better or worse ways of running economies. I think, you know, even in this highly oppressive system. So, for instance, I would rather live in the UK with the NHS than live in the US without a publicly funded healthcare system. And so I think, yeah, we have to look to examples such as participatory budgeting that Aisha mentioned, and inclusive forms of democracy, deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, which in different places and different levels, often at very local levels, and at the neighborhood level, for instance, people have sort of run experiments in these ways of organizing themselves. And I think we have to look to those examples to get a sense of what could come. And I say a sense because, like I say, I think if you imagine having run an economy and a society along a much more deliberative, participatory, inclusive basis for a number of generations, it will almost be like, you know, us trying to imagine what it must have been like to live under feudalism, or you know, for some of our ancestors to have been enslaved. That mercifully, fortunately, a lot of those formal relationships of slavery, those relationships of feudalism, have ended. And so it's like a distant memory. To learn about it, we have to go to the history books. I like to think that the scale of change that we would see and that we need to see in terms of how we reorganize our societies and economies is so profound that, yeah, it would be a completely different, it would enable us to be completely different human beings. It would open up our possibility, just as you know, we were talking before about how our possibilities are closed down by looking inward and by being fearful of what's coming, of who's around us. We're taught to kind of be skeptical of people who are trying to help us, or be suspicious and be quite inward, especially in the UK. That's a very sort of British trait, to be kind of quite insular. I like to think that in a society or a future that is equal to the possibilities of human flourishing, we would have all kinds of interactions and kind of openness with each other and in support of each other that would enable all kinds of sort of progressive interactions and exchanges. So I just feel like it's just, the potentials are huge. It's really hard to understate the potential for things to be better, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And I think we should imagine, and we should allow ourselves to imagine, what would it mean if you didn't have to work, you know, for the majority of your adult life? What if you were working? Yeah, perhaps you wouldn't even have work in the way that we understand it now. We would have activity that needs to be done, just as things need to get done, but it wouldn't be seen as maybe wage labor, where you're selling your labor power to an employer, and you're at risk potentially of being sacked by that employer if you don't do what they want, or if they don't want you anymore. How would that free up our mental space, our creativity? What about if really everybody had access to education? So not just a kind of a minority within a minority of people here in the UK, for instance. All of these things, I think, are just a glimpse of what could be achieved if we were to reorganize our economies and in a truly liberated way.
Thank you. And Samia, could you answer as well, please?
Yeah, like if younger me saw this question, I would like run away. I dropped out of economics in A-level, and I hated talk about economics because I remember when I first picked it up as A-level, it was just not a holistic subject. I studied geography at the side as well, because I've been an environmentalist since I was a little kid, and I hated how my teachers would not take into account the effects that the economy had on the environment. Every time I brought it in, they'll just be like, we're not social scientists, like leave that out of the equation. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is so scary. I'm gonna drop out because I prefer to like just study the environment and be in my la-di-da world, talk about sustainable futures. So yeah, I really like this question because I love bringing this in workshops when I work with young people. I usually ask them to draw what a future looks like, because some people don't have words, they have images, and the images tend to portray freedom, space, clean air, access to spaces, access to having time to do things the way that they want to. And I listed a few things that I would imagine what a liberated future looks like. So for me, it's like reforming education. So that example I just gave on me is experience in economics. I was like, why didn't they link economics with, environmental studies? Because it didn't make sense to me. Like every time we did talk about the environment, it was about extraction, like looking at the value of oil, looking at the value of precious metals. And yeah, I wish there was more like interconnected relationships in the curriculum. And I feel like people overlook the importance of material science. I want to see better investment in material science where we could look at alternatives of creating materials that we use in our day-to-day lives and assess, research, and see what is actually good for our planet, rather than creating materials over and over again where we end up degrading the planet even more. And I'm more interested in citizen science, so democratize the science. So giving people the tools to assess if their air is polluted, if their water is polluted, getting people connected with the land again, just simply because we don't want everything to be in the hands and control of the government, because as we see in our current lives, that is not going so well for us. It would be great to see if people had more knowledge about these things. And I think when people have knowledge about these things, they end up becoming more empowered, and they end up becoming more confident in entering spaces where they realize that their rights are being tarnished by higher powers. And yeah, I want to see more community projects. There's so many amazing projects that I've come across through volunteering and my past work experience. I learned about community energy last year, and it actually exists. It's already here today, and people don't really know about it. People don't realize that, yeah, you can create your own renewable energy project and get money and profit that you can invest in your own community. So you can start a solar panel project and sell off the energy and bring that in to invest in youth centers, youth projects, into any projects that is needed for your community. I would love to see more of that in the future. And secondly, I want to see more repair and reduce waste systems. We're in the age where Apple releases a new phone or a MacBook every couple of years, and people just chuck it to the side. And that waste ends up in countries that do not have the systems or the processes to deal with that waste. I would love to be in a society where people know exactly what their phones are made from, and rather than chucking it away, actually learn to repair it. My answers are generated around like citizen science, by the way. I'm just really a huge fan of like people taking ownership of their systems. And lastly, I really loved what you said, Leon, about a future where people's labor is just not dominated by their economic output, like their wages and labor. And I kind of summed that as people need space, time, and fun. I think we always take out fun and love out of this conversation, this equation. Well, I'm a climate justice activist because I want to protect the joy and love we have today and increase it. We do all of this work, this activist work, just simply because we don't want to lose our right to have fun. I know that sounds really dystopian, but we are living in a dystopia right now. And yeah, I've noticed in the pandemic where people have more time to sit down, reflect, and realize, oh, wait, the healthcare system is actually right for me. Oh, wait, the police system that we have in this country is not correct. So if we had more time, I think more and more people will become more aware of the systems they live in. And I think that helps us people like doing the work that Aisha, Leon does. Like you will have more people on your side because they actually have the time to discuss and dissect these things. Because right now, some people have other obligations. They're a caretaker. They have families that they need to take care of. If you're working from Monday to Friday, you want to use your evenings to nourish yourself, to rest, and you want to use your weekends again for personal reasons, and then it's work again. Where is the time in our weeks and our day-to-day lives where we can actually contribute in the system and actually think about the systems we live in? And that's basically my imagination in a snapshot. I could talk about this for hours.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I really like that. And I feel like, yeah, I really like what you said as well, Leon, about how it would be something we couldn't even conceive the way life is now in that future. It would be so different. So yes, these are some of the answers that everyone else has written in the audience. So thank you so much if you pulled your answer in. Yeah, and these are really great answers. Living wage, I'm seeing less poverty. I think this is a reference to that the donut book, and can cooperation. So thank you everyone for participating in that. We're going to go on to the final section. We may be running a bit over time because we started a bit late. Very sorry about that. So we're going to talk about what actions can we take to bring about this change that we want to see in the world. So we've talked about analysis, like what the problem is. We've talked about imagination, what we want to see. And now we're going to talk about how we're going to get there. Oh yeah, please put your questions in the Q&A function still if you would like to ask our speakers anything. So Aisha, could you tell us what exactly is organizing and movement building, and how the organizations you're part of using it to create this kind of change we want to see in the world?
Yeah, for sure. So, so both at NEON, the New Economy Organisers Network, and KIN, which is a network of Black activists across the country, we kind of organising and movement building are at the core. I think to start off with organising, because I think it's something that often people either don't understand or misunderstand. Like, organising is about building the power of people to transform systems and rebuild those systems. It's crucial, that building the power of people part, right? It's about kind of like leadership development, and it's about really investing kind of time and energy and resources in the communities that are most impacted by these things, such that they can lead us out of them and they can build, help build us out of them. And I think that too often when we talk about organising, or when we hear people talk about organising, it's framed as if it's a kind of politically neutral tool, like it's just a thing that you can do, and it's the same whether you want to change a street, a street lamp on your road, than it is if you want to like destroy neoliberalism. And I think the way that we think about organising at NEON and within KIN is really that kind of transformative piece that starts from the idea that we live in systems which are kind of designed to oppress us, and the only way that we can challenge, deconstruct and rebuild better systems is collectively together. And so that's kind of an inherently liberatory practice, right, is doing that work. And so that's a big element of what we do, is kind of working with people who are most directly affected to center their experiences and design strategies together for tackling a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. And then how that fits within the kind of overall movement building umbrella. So just to, again, caveat this, I think like organising, I think social movement, or movement in general, is a word that's bandied around a lot and doesn't necessarily mean a lot. Like sometimes I saw this thing the other day, it was like a T-Mobile advert that was like, join the movement. What does that even mean? But I think, again, we have to kind of reclaim this this understanding of kind of what a social movement, or at least an effective, systemic, successful social movement actually is. And I think the way that we think about it is it's a kind of like a collection or a network of groups working towards a broadly shared problem with different theories of change and approaches for how to get there. But it's a lot easier to tell in retrospect that something was a social movement than it is when you're kind of in one, which is part of why I think it can be difficult for folks. But essentially, the work that we do at NEON, and I think KIN, this is true of as well, is based on the idea that we don't currently have the social movements we need in the UK to win. I don't think we have them anywhere in the world, actually. and that's a big problem. And so a lot of our time and effort, I think, should be dedicated towards kind of building those social movements, and not just in the way that we often think about it, right? So getting people out on the streets for a demo or getting people to sign a petition, but building what we call the movement ecology. So every part of that movement, because social movements are people on the streets, but they're also people making sandwiches in community centres, and that's also people building alternatives like the co-ops and the time banks and the things that we've been talking about. It's people kind of campaigning and lobbying government, but it's also people helping survivors of domestic violence on the front line. It's all of those things, and we have to have that kind of holistic understanding of what a movement is to build it and make it more effective. And the last thing I'll say about our approach is it's kind of based on what we call the movement fundamentals. So like the 3 key ingredients that you need for a thriving, successful social movement. And the first one is movement consciousness. So that's just the idea of like, what is a movement? Am I in one? Who else is in it with me? Like, because so often, right, like culture, movements are the water that we're swimming in, and we're not really taking the time to poke our head out and be like, who else is around me, and what are they doing? So movement consciousness, I think, is a big thing that we work on. The second thing is movement appreciation. So I think it's not going to come as a surprise to anyone on this call that one of the biggest issues we have in our movements is beef and people just hating on each other and conflict and tearing each other down. And while we don't say you all have to love each other and have rainbows and smiles, what we do say is you don't have to love each other or even like each other, but you have to be aware that each other exists, and you have to at least think about what it might mean to work together, and I think sometimes that is too much of a nudge for people, but often where that actually gets to is people realizing like, oh, okay, if I'm aware of who else is in my movement space, and I can appreciate that even if they're not doing something I want to do myself, it's necessary to the struggle, then it leads to the step 3, which is movement leadership, right? So that is people being able to actually say, I know what's going on in the water that I'm swimming in. I know who else is doing it, and I appreciate that they exist. Let's now decide together where we want this movement to go. And so a lot of our work is really focused on getting people to that last point so that we can all be pulling in at least a similar direction for a specific period of time to achieve a goal. And it broadly works. There is a lot of beef still, and there is a lot of conflict. But I think the last thing I'll say just on this point is that when it comes to building the new economy, so often it feels like in our activist spaces, the economy is something that exists over there. And then you've got your grassroots activists working on clean air or working on housing for all or whatever, and they don't talk to each other, and they don't necessarily think that they should or they could. And I think it's the job predominantly of the new economy movement, because it's really well resourced and it's mainly white middle class people with lots of time and money, to expand that definition of what economic action should look like and bring those people in, because not only do they have a lot to learn from them, but that's the only way that we win the new economy, is by collectively creating a vision for what it should look like. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking. Yes, thanks.
That's fine. Thank you so much. Leon, would you like to, I didn't even ask the question. So that actually leads us nicely on to, talking about grassroots climate action. So Leon, could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm delighted to be sharing a panel with 2 of the people who know a lot about grassroots climate action themselves. But in terms of my own perspective, I mean, I think there are a range of initiatives that we can look to and draw strength and hope from. One of the initiatives that kind of taught me a lot in the past few years was the School Strikes for Climate, and I've met some really brilliant organizers off the back of that, taking part in some really sort of inspirational actions. That's very much on the kind of more maybe traditional form of action, model of action, and I think what Aisha said is right, that it's not just about getting people onto the streets, and although that is important and does make a difference in some ways, it's also about building capacity in communities where people are being directly affected by by the way in which the economy is organized and stitched up in such a way as to deny them resources and access to power. So if we go back to the definition of sort of the climate crisis that I was trying to work with at the start, one of the things I was trying to emphasize, whether or not I did a good job, hopefully I did some kind of a good job, and this will sound familiar and it won't sound too new, but one of the things I was trying to emphasize is that the climate crisis is deeply connected to how we organize our societies more broadly. So if we take that point, if we accept that point or that claim, then it doesn't become that disconnected to start to see many other campaigns in local areas, whether that's a campaign to keep a library open, whether that's a campaign to stop a local health service from being removed, whether or not that's a campaign for people to have access to healthy, nutritious food. All of these campaigns or kind of models of action start to be, or can be then be connected to the climate crisis, because we need a real plurality of approaches. We need lots of different people working in lots of different areas of economy and society, because the scale of the system that we're up against is huge. However, the scale of people's potential is also huge. We don't often realize it, and we're often discouraged from seeing that or believing it, and I'm told that we're powerless. But I think you can see lots of examples throughout history and throughout time and place of where people have managed to shift things in quite dramatic and radical directions in a very short space of time. Not always a short space of time. Sometimes, often it takes a long kind of lead-in period of underground or on the ground background work. But the point is that we do have that capacity when we work together. So I think if there are lots of different actions, I mean that I would support, and they're not all traditional kind of climate actions. A lot of them are anything that will build community in an area, and that will help people to realize and recognize their power. I'm behind and would support and encourage, because I think through that process of people building power, people becoming more politically conscious, perhaps being supported in developing skills of negotiating some of the formal structures of power, but also pushing against those formal structures and taking power back from those formal structures, which are often set up in such a way as to exclude them anyway. It's through that process that we can start to see some of the changes that will help to sort of dismantle this behemoth of a system that we face. So yeah, I think it very much depends on where you are as well, speaking both geographically and going back to the point that Samir made about, different parts of the world, different people have different lived experiences, which are very valuable to the movement. And we need a rich ecology of different organizations that will reflect the different lived experiences of people who will have to make up our movement. Workplace organizing is one that's going to be absolutely crucial as well, because most of us, whatever other identities we have, we are employees or workers. Unions haven't always been the best spaces for radical collective action, but they can be pushed in a more radical direction. And when they can't, we can set up counter or parallel organizations that better represent our own interests. Okay, yes, I will wrap it up there. I just also really want to echo Aisha's point that we have to be a bit humble or a bit tolerant and patient. I mean, I hope that's what Aisha was getting at. I mean, well, not hope, but that's what I read anyway. Like we're all experimenting. There is no single path. We need a plurality of approaches, and there isn't one right answer. So whilst we will hold ourselves to the highest standards in terms of trying to conduct ourselves with integrity and intention and compassion, we should also not hold ourselves as hostages to fortune and expect of people demands that are unrealistic. We should allow people space to make mistakes and to be supported as they grow through those mistakes and as they hopefully develop and learn from those mistakes. So a bit of kind of tolerance and patience within our movements. All right, I'll shut up.
No, thank you so much. That was really helpful. And yeah, I think the importance of experiments is really important in this kind of like imaginary, like future building work. Samir, could you tell us a bit more about what climate justice activism is? And yeah, just tell us a bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like Leon in the last section answered that really nicely and beautifully. But yeah, in my own experience, just to, in case someone here hasn't come across like the term climate justice, is simply just interconnecting like environmental issues with social justice issues. That's to play it really simply. I'm oversimplifying it because once you go down the rabbit hole, you realize, oh wow, like this world is so messed up and very interconnected, and it's like a web of issues just connected together in different perspectives, different like experiences. So yeah, climate justice activism, it's definitely blown up as we've seen in the past few years. Like you've seen like school strikes, you've seen people come online and raise awareness through different forms of media across social media. And what I loved about this journey where we're at currently is that in the past 2 years, I've connected with people who live on islands that are basically disappearing because of rising sea levels. I know climate justice activists from islands such as Tuvalu and other Polynesian islands. Like, I've learned so much just from simply connecting with them and say, hey, I care about this, you care about this too. And that is what climate activism should be. Whereas like we actually connect and we don't stay in our silos and be like, I know this through my own lens and my experience, and I'm just going to stay here and keep this knowledge and experience to myself. It's more about sharing the knowledge that we have, even if we can't relate to it on an individual level, but understand that what we're oppressed by is the same systems, and that we are all collectively trying to fight for our rights and our futures. And yeah, I think it's very important to tackle the climate crisis because this is not a thing that's just happening in the UK, it's happening globally. And that climate justice basically addresses the imbalances of power, wealth, and decision-making processes. And as someone who was born and raised in the UK, I've noticed the privilege I've had, even though I am marginalized in this country on a global level. I am privileged in a sense that I have access to rights where I can go protest in the streets sometimes, I can speak out and be politically empowered, whereas some of my counterparts in other countries will get arrested just from posting something on social media. I have counterparts where they will walk down the street with a placard without any violence, will get arrested. And climate justice is simply addressing those imbalances, not just in the system, but within our movements as well, because it's important to understand people's humanity and access to rights, where essentially we're trying to not replicate the systems that we're fighting against in our movements. We don't want to create that imbalance of power again, because we're trying to experiment and figure out how does working collectively work. Obviously, we all have different capacities and different access to resources, but surely we need to spend more time in addressing that in order to build sustainable, equitable futures. And that's essentially what we're fighting for, equitable futures where people are collectively liberated, but also basically just shedding off the old world, because we know it's not sustainable, not just for our access to healthcare, our access to basic human rights, but also to our mental health as well. This system we live in is not sustainable for our physical and mental health. And I'm just gonna like keep it there because I'm conscious of time. But if anyone wants to hear me talk about this, you can just follow me on social media. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sonia. So we are out of time. We've gone over by 5 minutes. So unfortunately, we're not going to have time for any of the questions. I'm really sorry. But yeah, just quickly. So thank you so much, speakers. Like, it's been amazing to listen to you guys talk about all your work. And I'm really grateful to have you here. And if you just want to quickly say where everyone can find you, I think we've got most of your ats on the page already. But if there's anywhere else you'd like people to get in contact with you or to read about your work, please feel free to just plug yourselves now.
Oh, should I go? Yeah, I'm at Aisha TS on Twitter. I don't really tweet very much, but you can follow me if you want. And I work at Neon, so you can get in touch with me through the Neon website as well if you want to, and I think that's it. Yeah. Oh, and I host an F podcast, and that's nice, so you should subscribe and listen. It's called the Weekly Economics Podcast, and we talk about like top hot issues of the day from an economic angle, with great guests. So recommend my own podcast. Thank you for having me. It's been really, really wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. It's been great to have you. Leon?
Yeah, sorry, I'm also on social media at Leon.io, at Leon_IO. I don't think I have anything to say other than, yeah, I hope to bump into some of you all as we, in some of the spaces in which we'll be liberating ourselves from this corrupt economy.
Definitely. Thank you. And Samia?
You can follow me, as it says there, at Samia. I wrote it like that because people don't know how to pronounce my name. And you can follow at Seize the Vote on Instagram. That's where we do our work, but we're on a hiatus because we're building some tools to get people more politically empowered and engaged in the local communities. And yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn as well at Samia Dumbuya. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We're going to leave the chat open just for a little bit more to make sure everyone can see the links. If you have time, it'd be really great for you to fill out the feedback form that I've just sent the link for in the chat, and that would really help with hosting these events in the future. Thank you to the Ubele Initiative for hosting. And I'm just going to put everyone's links in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's been really great. So take care and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.